Hey folks, I'm going to share some fiction with you. This is from a book that I wrote originally in 2011 and stopped writing originally in 2012. I worked on it for a year and then I plucked at it since then, and I've been going through it and trying to make it ready for everybody to look at and make it pleasing enough for me to let go into the world. And so, as practice for that, I'm reading pieces of this, and linked in the description is another couple pieces from this. But tonight's from later on in the novel. I don't think you really need to know what's going on other than the fact that my character is in California. I think the year is 2002. Yeah. You find yourself standing, your back against a car. The central California mid-June wind cooling but still heated, and you find that you are not alone. A body is pressing into yours, and she is making sounds like this very much feels pleasant. Yet you feel nothing but the simmerings of guilt. For she is young, 17 to your 25, and your father has been ruling over you in his eros aspect, continually devouring your self-assuredness, this week beneath his roof, leading up to your sister's wedding. The girl's breasts brim with warmth like a cornucopia microwaved on low for 5 to 7 minutes, and you feel her touch growing into you and so inviting, and you would lose yourself into her, if only. If only. Her floral scent and freely flung affections, her charming choice of words, her breath and laughter nearly forcing this affair on you as she pulls you from the limitless overbearing disapproval of your ancestors, or in the least your father, whose critical wrath has worked to strip you down to a weak-spined version of yourself, and yet, as you are no less a man, want still reigns within you, and so you thread your fingers through her not long, not short, entirely chestnut hair, and begin to recite your poetries, belles and lettres, sent looping by means of tongue toward her ear in order to make her shiver, for she is 17, going on and primed for the exultant flashbang tossed from Cupid's arsenal, the sparkle charge emitted by the popping of the bubble space that defines us up to a certain point, that socialized boundary that clefts us apart, and that cleaving together gives way to passion and to pleasure, and even, eventually, to another person, to a whole race of people, sanctioned and instituted each and every weekend by one couple's public binding after another, their sacramentalized kiss made licit in the light of all those witnesses arranged in rows and dressed up formal and looking on the two who pledged their lives to one another, which in the absence of those witnessing eyes and of that institution, and rather now moving lips against her lips in the dark against this car, after a day of ceremony and celebration, in the absence of those witnesses, alone now here with her who pushes firmly her body into yours, you dream up eyes of judgment bearing down on you two in this illicit embrace, this technically illegal embrace, this embrace that spontaneously caught you off guard and that you excruciate within, and yet enjoy as eyes closed you recall how earlier, at the reception, between making eyes at her, making eyes at you, a childhood friend of your father's opened up the catch-up conversation by asking you about your life. And you told him either that you were writing code or writing fiction. And either could have been the case, but for the sake of our telling, we'll say he heard you were a fictionist, and in response asked what your fictions were about, and you told him about The Bidden Fruit, written in the blank gray book which chronicled the generations between Eden and the flood, which mythopoeic reenactment, or as you half-jokingly said to Stan, a work of biblical fan fiction, was concerned with the exploits of Adam's firstborn son, the Said, Anwas, and how he strove for something more than normal life, and how he worked toward founding something astounding and unique, and how this ambition affected his 3 sons, how the firstborn was illegitimate and wild, how the second was holy and yet wholly ineffectual, and how the third was powerful, viciously, amorally powerful. And what about these 3 brothers' father, this Anwas who wanted more? He sounds like someone we both know. Father, you wanted to stand and shout across the banquet of your sister's wedding. Father, Father, I knew you in my every word and dream. I carry you inside my every worry, guilt, and judgment of myself and others. I knew you, and yet I never know you. And as you stand now knowing her now, with your back sloping along the driver's side window, she sending her warmth to flower into you whilst around you winds the June air filled with Fresno's dust and the Central Valley's heat, and you wish her to be made the midwife of your stories, the doula of your inklings, the wet nurse of your fleeting, reaching and yet not quite believed enough to be made real stories, and you wonder why you were not born yourself a woman, your chest swollen with emotions pap, your skills with kids and your perpetual childlikeness, and you almost could be a woman but for these parchment brittle thoughts. And this blasted, flashing phallic blade, which the opprobriums of your father all this week have undermined, and your defiance has incited into a firm and brittle againstness. As the shall not and the will do wrench fractaline along the curving spine your fingers trace, your face, her hair, twisting in the wind, in thousands convolutions of valor, chastity, cockiness, cowardice, concupiscence, courage. Yes, you are erect and responsive in the virile fashion, but your father in his dark sign took you aside this morning before leaving to go set up the reception, and from his bed, peering over his science fiction novel, recumbent on his bed, but still somehow looking down on you, saying, were it not for your mother, were it not for your sister, you, Thomas, Tommy, Patience, Stephen, or whoever you are pretending to be, would be told to leave. You would be sent away. And he pinned you there, defining you as defiant, wrong, rebellious, with your cult and your errant belief and your outright recalcitrance against who has sired you, who has fashioned you in his own image. The same image that you ever carry there inside you, always knowing and never knowing, trying always to forget and finding all over again in the broken pieces of its floor-dashed mask, the same mask he used to stare you down and down at you until the walls around his face dimmed blank, and all was overcome by his severity, declaring, you are not welcome, you are not wanted, you do not belong here in my house. And how had he come to this? How had you driven him there? Was it accident or miscalculation that made you blow up at him on the ride to Fresno from the Pacific Northwest with him and your brother who you handed Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha to, saying it was an insightful examination of the struggle for personal truth or something? And because there was a Buddha on its cover, your Christian pastor father sneered and shook his head and said, you guys are always seeking, looking everywhere for truth when truth is knocking at your door. And yet you choose to ignore it. You plug your ears with these experiments and with your drugs and your desires and all these falsehoods. And what did you do but lose your temper? What did you do but ask him outright if everything in the world that he denies and he deplores is done so not from a connection with truth, but rather a fear that he is not right, that he is just a man, that he is just as full of fault as any other, believer or non, or believer in wrongs, and his certainties are in the end founded not on some sort of eternal, divine, begotten truth, but a collection of disparate, historically inaccurate, man-minced trivia based on sayings and beliefs that are as arbitrary as any schematic of the life beyond, which we can't know explicitly, if not presently and directly inside our lives. And he was silent then as your anger evaporated and then condensed into his anger. Twining through the silent car as through the Shasta forestry, you three drove within the van, filled with his silent anger and your imploding reactivity steeping for the rest of the drive, until you three arrived at the house. They were in the middle of packing and preparation for their move from California to Washington State, and as all the family was in the midst of greeting, he asked your mother if there wasn't somewhere else we could have Patience stay. The quotes he put with his voice around your chosen name, hinting clearly at his disapproval of your chosen cult, the one that will not be made explicit in these pages. And you laughed and chided so all could hear. "Welcome home, son. Let's kill the fatted calf and find you somewhere else to sleep." And everyone laughed. But Father's face was as dark as Uros facing the deep that first time in the beginning that you had invented or had assembled from other origins than the book he raised you on, and he has based his life and thoughts and career upon too. And as he became unforgiving Uros, your heart was become chaos herself, clamoring anxiously in vortices of plenty, teeming with your childhood fear of him and all your guilt for having done wrong or having been wrong, all stirring in you the want to mock his Bible further, to misquote in a deadpan drawl, "In my Father's house there are many, many, many rooms, so long as you leave your questions at the knuckle-polished door." And so on. All week long, the two of you clashed titanically. Like titans, you devoured one another's assertions and beliefs, and you could not sustain your strength, and you could not maintain your confidence, not beneath the brunt of his authority undermining your erected and then broke down and then re-erected doctrines of personality and belief, until now you feel the fullness of your failure, coincident with the fullness of your want, as the too young woman wraps you with her limbs and tender touches, whispering a name that works to deflate your defiance and smother your swirling doubts. And as your egregious and unbecoming cock protrudes into the yielding belly born upon it, still kept in clothes away from her, you sigh and say the name of God that you have chosen, and you put your lips against her neck and open them to taste her, sweetly taste her, drawing dim the coruscating lights, shifting angelic sparks and charges. Oh, oblations flung to the faltering amorica, merging eros to so, distance you, further from Father and his command on you, to not invent, but to obey, to not explore, but to accept, to not create, but rather cower beneath the iron yoke of righteousness, the yoke that demands that you be tame, that you be good, when you are not good. Not really, no. Never good enough. You breathe her in, and deeply, and would to take this brown-haired dame into a place that you have found, into a state beyond the sum of what you cleave against this car. Beyond the two you two might flee, but then forever bound you'll be. For past a certain reach of touch, you cannot cut the light of sun from the glow of that gray mirror rock, so full above you, cut her. draw the blade and cut her, slice her open and reveal her life. But your blade is buried behind your belt. That were you to loose, to use, to make the moon and sun become a one, then two, you two will be tuned to one another, even in a brief infinity. And then she will be in you, always, always there inside you, always. For you know this much about your laws, that inside you glimmer still the Tiffany's and Renee's, the Natalias and Rubies too, gleaming, glittering, gathering your wishes and crafting of them dim realities, cloaks, and dark planets, spins. No, then, no, you should not do this to her, take her, don't. And yet the blue light gathers in a flare and begins to peel away the world, declaring possible what might become. If you to take to her taking touch. Her smiles, whispers, her wit overmuch, young, but malleable and infatuant. Oh, through them you may find and found a newness, unique, pristine, and perhaps eminently believable, if only. The present tense woman-girl sighs a strange name again into you, and as you mush bodies beneath the streetlights, you proceed to drink another draught of her before you say thank you, kiss her chin and then her forehead, then get into the car and drive to the house that has no room for prodigy or prodigal or the person you've been trying to become, asking as you enter the domain of the author of at least your physical envelope, can one become a bastard after the fact? In the garage bedroom, feeling the echo of having been touched, the answer comes or does not come. Truth is always cheap from the man who gives vent to every word in his mind, but he who learns on silence to stand, to himself the vastness will bind.